He was born into a life where duty was decided before he could speak, before he could understand what a master was or why another man's survival would one day define his own existence. From the beginning, his world was shaped by ownership, by the quiet understanding that his body did not belong to him. The plantation, the house, the routines of the day, all of it revolved around the needs of one man whose life mattered more than his own. There was no ceremony when this responsibility began, no declaration. It simply became clear, over time, that his purpose was to keep the master alive, no matter the cost. The master was not a strong man. His body failed him often. Illness came and went like a tide, sometimes receding, sometimes returning with greater force. There were days when he could not rise from bed, nights when his breathing grew shallow and uncertain. In those moments, the enslaved man was summoned. He learned the signs of danger before others noticed them. He learned how to steady a shaking hand, how to cool a fever, how to keep a fragile body from slipping too close to death. These skills were not taught out of kindness. They were learned because failure meant punishment and success meant survival, for both of them, but in very different ways. From the outside, it might have looked like devotion, a loyal servant attending faithfully to his master, always present, always alert. But devotion implies choice, and there was none. This was not a role he volunteered for. It was a burden placed upon him by force. Each act of care was performed under the shadow of threat. If the master lived, the system continued. If the master died too soon, blame would search for a place to land, and it would not fall on white shoulders. Duty, in this world, was simply another name for fear. His days became measured by another man's heartbeat. He slept lightly, listening for changes in breath, ready to rise at the slightest sound. His own exhaustion was irrelevant. His own illness, if it came, had to be hidden or ignored. There was no space for weakness. The master's needs always came first, and the enslaved man learned to erase himself to meet them. Over time, this erasure became routine. He no longer thought of his own comfort as something worth considering. Survival demanded obedience, and obedience demanded silence. Years passed this way, one indistinguishable from the next. 20 years is a long time to live inside someone else's body, to know another man's pain better than your own. He knew the exact way the master groaned when death felt close, the exact words spoken when fear crept in during the night. He knew which remedies worked and which only delayed the inevitable. He became, in every practical sense, the keeper of the master's life. And yet, despite this intimacy, the distance between them never closed. One was human by law, the other was property. The cruelty of this arrangement was not always loud. Often, it was quiet and ordinary. The master might thank him on a good day, might even speak of trust or dependence. But gratitude did not change ownership. Kind words did not loosen chains. The enslaved man understood this better than anyone. He knew that his value was conditional, tied entirely to usefulness. As long as the master lived, he had a purpose. Beyond that, he was replaceable. There is a particular kind of suffering that comes from being essential and disposable at the same time. For 20 years, this man held another's life together, knowing that his own could be sold, beaten, or ended without consequence. He watched doctors come and go, men with titles and authority who relied on his observations even as they dismissed his presence. He absorbed knowledge, learned patterns, and carried responsibility without recognition. If the master survived, others took credit. If the master worsened, suspicion lingered. This duty consumed his identity. He was no longer known by his own name, if he ever had one recorded. He became the one who watches, the one who knows, the one who keeps him alive. His entire existence narrowed to a single function. Dreams, if he had them, were dangerous. Hope was a luxury he could not afford. To hope was to risk disappointment, and disappointment could be deadly. Yet beneath this enforced obedience, something human persisted. In the quiet hours, when the house slept and the master's breathing steadied, thoughts crept in uninvited. What would life be without this constant vigilance? What would it mean to wake without fear? These questions had no answers, but they existed all the same. The mind, even when caged, continues to wander. The system depended on this kind of silent endurance. It relied on enslaved people performing extraordinary acts of care while receiving nothing in return. It relied on the illusion that proximity created loyalty, that years of service transformed obligation into affection. But the truth was far harsher. The enslaved man did not save the master's life out of love. He did it because the system demanded it, because punishment waited on the other side of failure. As the years accumulated, the master aged visibly. His body weakened further, his dependence grew. The enslaved man's role became even more central, yet his position did not improve. No promise of freedom came, no legal recognition followed. Time, which should have softened injustice, only deepened it. Each saved crisis extended the same arrangement indefinitely. In this way, duty became a trap. By excelling at keeping the master alive, the enslaved man prolonged his own bondage. His competence ensured continuation. The better he performed, the longer the system benefited. This cruel paradox lay at the heart of his existence. Survival required success, but success guaranteed captivity. The first keynote of this story is not heroism, but entrapment. It is the story of a life bound not by loyalty, but by necessity. It is the story of how slavery turned care into coercion, how it forced human beings to preserve the lives of those who owned them while denying their own. Before the betrayal, before the sale, before the final cruelty revealed itself, there was this long, quiet endurance, a life spent holding another man together, knowing that when the duty ended, nothing waited on the other side. 20 years is not a number that can be understood quickly. It is not just time passing, it is time pressing down, shaping a life until there is almost nothing left that belongs to the person living it. For 2 decades, the enslaved man's days unfolded in a narrow circle, always returning to the same purpose, keeping the master alive. Seasons changed, faces around him aged or disappeared, but his role remained fixed. Morning began with checking breath and movement, night ended with listening for pain or distress. His own life became secondary, almost theoretical, while another man's survival was immediate and constant. Over time, he learned the master's body more intimately than any doctor ever could. He knew when an illness was coming before symptoms appeared, sensed it in the way the master shifted in bed, or spoke a little slower than usual. He understood which foods weakened him, which weather worsened his condition, which pains were real, and which were exaggerated by fear. This knowledge was not written down or rewarded. It lived only in the enslaved man's mind, refined through years of observation and repetition. His memory became a living record, his attention a form of medicine. This kind of sacrifice did not announce itself. There were no dramatic rescues, no single moment that defined his service. Instead, it was the quiet accumulation of care, nights without sleep, days spent alert while others rested, moments of crisis resolved without acknowledgement. He steadied the master during fevers, cleaned him when weakness made dignity impossible, shielded him from harm when his own strength failed. The master lived because someone else endured. Familiarity grew, but it was a dangerous familiarity. The enslaved man knew the master's vulnerabilities, his fears of death, his moments of helplessness. In another world, such knowledge might have created equality. In this one, it changed nothing. Power remained one-sided. The master could still command, punish, sell. Dependence did not weaken authority, only deepened entitlement. The master came to expect survival as something owed to him. There were moments when gratitude surfaced, spoken softly in the aftermath of recovery. Words like faithful or good were offered as if they carried weight. But gratitude in slavery was always hollow. It did not come with rights or protection. It did not change the fact that the enslaved man could be whipped, sold, or replaced. He learned not to trust kind words, because kindness that exists without action is just another form of control. The years blurred together, marked not by milestones in his own life, but by the master's illnesses. Each crisis became a test, not just of skill, but of endurance. Failure meant danger. Success meant continuation. There was no exit. His expertise became a chain, binding him more tightly with every year he proved indispensable. The better he became at saving the master's life, the less likely he was to ever be freed. Emotionally, the cost was immense. Caring for someone for so long creates attachment, even when that attachment is unwanted. He could not afford to hate the master openly. Hatred required distance, and distance was impossible. Nor could he afford to hope for affection in return. Instead, he existed in a narrow emotional space, suppressing feelings that might weaken him. To feel too much was dangerous. To feel nothing at all was impossible. The illusion of trust was perhaps the cruelest part. The master relied on him completely, trusted him with his most fragile moments. yet never questioned the system that kept that trust one-sided. Trust did not mean equality, it meant expectation without obligation. The enslaved man was expected to be loyal, discreet, tireless. The master was expected to live. As the master aged, his dependence deepened. Doctors became less effective. Remedies failed more often. The enslaved man's role expanded further, filling gaps left by others. He became nurse, guard, attendant, and protector. Each role added responsibility without adding rights. His life narrowed further, defined entirely by another's decline. In quiet moments, he may have wondered what would happen when the master finally died. The thought was dangerous but unavoidable. Would years of service mean something then? Would freedom come as a reward? The system encouraged such questions by never answering them. Hope was allowed to exist, just enough to keep obedience intact. But hope in slavery was a trap. It kept people compliant, waiting for mercy that rarely arrived. The enslaved man's 20 years of sacrifice built an illusion of moral debt, a belief that such devotion must eventually be recognized. That illusion sustained him through exhaustion and despair. It was also what made the eventual betrayal so devastating. For 20 years, he gave everything he had, his time, his strength, his knowledge, his emotional restraint. He lived inside another man's life, keeping it intact while his own remained suspended. The nation would later tell stories of loyal servants and grateful masters, but the reality was far darker. Loyalty was not chosen, it was enforced. Sacrifice was not honored, it was exploited. By the end of those 20 years, the enslaved man was no longer just a caretaker. He was a living extension of the master's survival. And when that survival finally ended, the system would show its true face, revealing that no amount of sacrifice could ever purchase humanity in a world designed to deny it. The moment the master died, the house changed its sound. The long vigilance that had filled the IR for years suddenly had nowhere to go. The enslaved man stood in the stillness, listening to a silence he had never known. A silence that did not feel like peace. For 20 years, his life had been measured by another man's breath, by the rise and fall of a chest he had watched more closely than his own. Now that breath was gone, and with it, the illusion that everything he had given might finally matter. There was no ceremony for him. The death was not his to mourn openly, even though grief and exhaustion tangled inside him. He had carried the weight of survival for so long that the absence of duty felt disorienting, almost frightening. His body remained alert, waiting for a call that would never come. He had spent years preparing for emergencies, but no one had prepared him for irrelevance. Others entered the room, speaking in low voices, arranging the body, discussing arrangements. Their words passed over him as if he were furniture. He was no longer essential. His expertise, his attention, his 20 years of sacrifice had expired at the exact moment the master did. In the eyes of the system, his purpose had ended. There was no pause to acknowledge what he had done. No recognition of the nights without sleep. The illnesses prevented. The crises managed quietly in the dark. Death did not produce gratitude, it produced inventory. The estate had to be settled. Property had to be assessed. And he, like everything else, was counted. The same hands that had depended on him signed papers that reduced him to a line of value. His age, his condition, his usefulness were discussed without reference to the life he had preserved. The irony was merciless. A man who had spent 2 decades keeping another alive was now evaluated with cold efficiency, as if his entire existence could be priced and transferred without consequence. The sale happened quickly. It did not require deliberation. He was no longer needed in that house, no longer tied to that life. Whatever fragile bond outsiders might imagine between caretaker and master dissolved instantly under the weight of profit. The master's death freed nothing but assets. There was no time for goodbyes, no moment to gather himself. The enslaved man was moved along with furniture, tools, and land deeds. His 20 years of service did not earn him a pause, let alone freedom. The system revealed its truth with brutal clarity. Loyalty did not create protection. Sacrifice did not create belonging. Nothing he had done altered his status as property. As he was led away, the house receded behind him, carrying with it the only life he had known for 2 decades. It was not home, but it was familiar. Even that familiarity was denied to him now. The system did not care about continuity or trauma. It cared about transactions. The weight of betrayal settled slowly. It was not shock, it was recognition. Somewhere deep inside, he had known this outcome was possible. Yet hope had survived anyway, nurtured by years of depth. endance, and whispered gratitude. That hope now collapsed under the undeniable truth that slavery recognized no moral debt. The master's survival had been valuable only while it continued. This moment exposed the lie at the heart of countless stories told later about faithful servants and benevolent masters. Faithfulness did not protect him. Benevolence did not exist beyond convenience. The enslaved man had been useful, and usefulness had an expiration date. As he was sold, his past did not follow him in any meaningful way. His knowledge, his experience, his 20 years of expertise were invisible on the page. He was reduced to a body, valued for what labor it might still produce elsewhere. The years he had given were treated as if they had never happened. Emotionally, the rupture was devastating. He had built his life around a role that no longer existed. Identity, already fragile, fractured completely. Who was he now, without the duty that had consumed him? The system offered no answer, because it did not consider such questions relevant. The new owner did not ask about the past. There was no curiosity about the man who had preserved a life for 20 years. The future demanded only obedience and productivity. The past was a closed book, its pages discarded. This was the final cruelty, not just the sale, but the erasure. The enslaved man's sacrifice vanished into silence, unrecorded and unacknowledged. The master's life would be remembered, marked by dates and property transfers. The man who kept that life intact would leave no trace. What happened that day was not unusual. It was routine. Slavery thrived on such moments, moments where humanity collided with economics, and economics won without hesitation. The sale revealed the system in its purest form, stripped of sentiment and illusion. In later years, stories might be told of loyalty and devotion, of servants who stayed by their master's sides. These stories would omit the ending. They would not speak of the sale, of the immediate replacement of care with calculation. They would not mention that devotion was met with disposability. The enslaved man carried this truth with him into whatever came next. It reshaped how he understood the world, how he guarded his heart, how he survived. He had learned, finally and irrevocably, that nothing he gave could purchase recognition in a system designed to deny it. The same day the master died, something else was buried. Any remaining illusion that sacrifice could overcome bondage. The story ended not with freedom or gratitude, but with a transaction. And in that ending lies the most honest record of what slavery was, a system where even the greatest devotion could be erased in a single stroke of a pen. What followed the sale was not just a change of ownership, but a slow unmaking of whatever remained of the man he had been. The road carried him away from the place where 20 years of his life had been spent, but it did not carry meaning with it. Meaning had been stripped away at the moment he was priced and transferred. In the new place, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and commands, there was no recognition of his past. No one knew what he had done, and no one cared to ask. History, for enslaved people, did not travel with them. It was left behind, scattered and lost. The new routine began immediately, indifferent to grief or disorientation. Labor resumed as if nothing had happened, as if a life of sacrifice had not just ended in betrayal. His body moved from habit more than will, following instructions, performing tasks without resistance. Survival required adaptation, and adaptation required silence. Speaking of the past would have invited suspicion or punishment. Remembering openly was dangerous. Inside him, however, memory did not fade. It pressed harder in the absence of purpose. For years, his days had been structured around another's survival. Now that structure was gone, leaving space filled with exhaustion and reflection. At night, when work ended and the world grew quieter, thoughts returned uninvited. He replayed moments of care, crises narrowly avoided, nights spent listening for breath. He wondered how something that had required so much of him could vanish so completely from the world's account. This is how slavery extended its cruelty beyond physical chains. It forced people to invest themselves fully in roles that would never be acknowledged, then erased those roles without consequence. The pain was not only in what was taken, but in what was denied afterward, the right to have one's life recognized as meaningful. Over time, the story of his sacrifice became something he carried alone. There were no records, no witnesses willing to speak. The system had no interest in preserving such truths. Acknowledging them would have exposed the moral emptiness at its core. It was easier to let these lives dissolve into anonymity, to allow silence to do its work. He aged quietly. The strength that had sustained years of vigilance slowly diminished, worn down by labor and time. With age came another layer of invisibility. Older enslaved people were often valued less, their usefulness questioned, their presence tolerated rather than needed. The same system that had exploited his dedication now prepared to discard him again when his body could no longer produce enough value. Yet something endured that could not be measured or sold. The memory of injustice sharpened his understanding of the world. He learned not to confuse dependence with respect, not to mistake familiarity for protection. These lessons were not hopeful, but they were clarifying. They stripped away illusions and replaced them with a quiet, resilient awareness. If he spoke at all, it was cautiously, in fragments shared with those who understood the danger of listening. Stories passed in whispers, incomplete and unverified, carried more as warnings than as history. This was how truth survived among the enslaved. Not in official record, DS, but in guarded memory. The larger world moved on without him. The master's name remained attached to property, to transactions, perhaps even to praise for prosperity or longevity. The man who had preserved that life disappeared from the narrative entirely. This imbalance was not accidental. It was necessary for the system to function. Recognition would have implied humanity, and humanity would have demanded change. In time, even his own memory of the 20 years began to blur at the edges, softened by exhaustion and age. But the emotional truth remained intact. He remembered the moment of sale clearly, the sudden clarity it brought. That moment became the center of his understanding, the point around which all other memories revolved. It was the moment the system revealed itself without disguise. This keynote of the story does not end with resolution, because slavery offered none. It ends with continuation, with a man carrying forward in silence, his sacrifice unmarked and unrewarded. His life did not become a lesson for the nation at the time. It became buried, folded into the countless unnamed stories that built the country without being allowed to belong to it. What remains now is the act of remembering, long after the system that erased him has been condemned but not fully reckoned with. To speak of him is to resist the silence that followed him for so long. It is to acknowledge that history is incomplete when it tells only of those who owned power, and not of those who sustained it with their lives. His story stands as evidence of a truth often avoided, that slavery did not fail to recognize humanity by accident. It refused to recognize it by design, and in that refusal, it left behind a vast, unmarked grave of lives lived in sacrifice and erased in silence. What ultimately remains after everything has been taken is not freedom, not justice, and not even recognition, but endurance itself. The enslaved man lived on, not because the world softened, but because survival was demanded of him again and again. His body carried forward through years that no longer promised anything beyond continuation. Time moved differently now. It was no longer measured by another man's breathing or crises narrowly avoided. It was measured by endurance, by how much could be carried without breaking. As years passed, his story did not become clearer to others. It became quieter. Silence wrapped around his life so completely that even absence went unnoticed. He existed in the margins of a society that had already extracted everything of value from him. This is how slavery completed its work, not just by exploiting labor, but by leaving people alive long enough to disappear. There were moments when he wondered if survival itself was a kind of resistance, or simply another expectation placed upon him. He had been forced to outlive the purpose that had defined him, forced to continue without explanation or closure. The world did not pause to consider what that required. It simply demanded more. Memory became both refuge and burden. To remember was painful, but forgetting felt like a second death. He carried the memory of 20 years of sacrifice not because it brought comfort, but because it was the only proof that his life had contained meaning beyond labor. No one else would preserve that truth. If he let it go, it would vanish entirely. He saw younger enslaved people enter the same cycle he had endured, their lives narrowing quickly around tasks and obedience. In their faces he recognized the same early hope he once carried, the belief that loyalty might lead somewhere, that sacrifice might soften injustice. He did not always speak against it. Sometimes silence felt kinder than destroying hope too early. Other times, a quiet warning passed between them, understood without being stated. The system continued as it always had, efficient and indifferent. It absorbed bodies, used them, replaced them. Individual stories mattered only in how well they served production. Anything else was excess, something to be discarded. The enslaved man's long life did not disrupt this machinery. It only proved how thoroughly it functioned. What makes his story unbearable is not just the betrayal or the sale, but the fact that nothing about it was unusual. This happened repeatedly, to countless people whose devotion, skill, and endurance were consumed and erased. The nation was built not only on forced labor, but on forced forgetting. In later years, when the idea of slavery began to be challenged more openly, when arguments about morality and humanity entered public discourse, his life remained untouched by those debates. Change, when it comes, often arrives too late for those who needed it most. His suffering had already been absorbed into the past, its usefulness complete. He did not become a symbol in his lifetime. He did not become a story worth telling. He remained one man among many, carrying a private history the world had no interest in hearing. And yet, it is precisely this ordinariness that gives his life its weight. There were no dramatic rebellions, no recorded defiance, no moment that history could easily frame as heroic. There was only endurance under conditions designed to deny dignity. If there is a quiet power in his story, it lies in that endurance. Not the kind that is celebrated or romanticized, but the kind that persists without reward. The kind that exposes the emptiness of narratives that praise loyalty without examining what loyalty cost. Long after his body weakened and his steps slowed, long after his labor was considered expendable, the truth of his life remained intact, waiting to be spoken. It waited through generations of silence, through records that named owners but not the owned, through histories that favored comfort over honesty. To tell his story now is not to offer redemption. It is to refuse erasure. It is to acknowledge that a man gave 20 years of his life to preserving another's existence and was discarded the moment that usefulness ended, and that this was not an exception, but a rule. The final keynote of his life is not resolution, but reckoning. A reckoning delayed, incomplete, and still unfolding. His endurance asks a question history must answer. How many lives were sustained by people who were never allowed to fully live their own? He did not leave behind monuments or records. What he left behind was evidence that slavery's greatest violence was not only what it did, but what it refused to see. And as long as his story is told, even this late, the silence that followed him is broken, and the endurance that kept him alive becomes a form of truth. The system could not destroy,